Well, one of the core issues, and we've touched upon this, is in setting fair and adequate pricing policy is to really understand the costs of drug development and what drives investors to commit the tremendous funding numbers that are necessary. Dr. Steve Potts is a biotech drug developer at the International Cancer Advocacy Network. He has over 20 years of experience as a biotech entrepreneur, including work with small molecules, complex cell therapies, and biologicals. He has contributed to 2 approved drugs, and perhaps even more interesting to hear about will be the larger number of molecules that he's worked on that have not reached approval. He has held many leadership positions in founding companies and managing large drug development initiatives. He has raised billions of dollars over the course of his career in venture capital funding. And he holds a PhD in biological engineering and an MBA. We're all very interested to hear what you have to add to the discussion, Dr. Potts.
Thanks again, Steve. What a great, opportunity to go after some of the other speakers. And I want to focus today on 2 things, really. One is it's been about a year since IRA passed. So we're in July, about July of last year. And then, what damage are we already seeing? And what data do we have that there's already been an impact? And then secondly, and this is maybe provocative where I don't have concrete answers, is how do we measure in the next couple of years ongoing damage? And if you don't measure something, and I'm a scientist, we don't measure it, it kind of doesn't exist. And so, I want to kind of focus our thoughts on that. What data is out there today in the last year that shows damage, and then how we think about measuring the impact of this going forward. There's really 2 big funding groups. The government does fund drug development, but it's a much lower amount than these other 2 groups. One is large pharma companies, and then the others is venture. And it's obviously difficult. No one's going to be invited into any company developing drugs in this competitive environment. So you're not going to see insights into how people think in a boardroom when they make investments, based on what happens with an act like IRA. The venture side is more interesting because, those of us that are entrepreneurs are out there. We're fundraising. Just as an example, my last company I raised 75 million. I had about 100 no's for every 1 yes. That's how it works. I had an article I wrote kind of for the general public called it Shark Tank for Nerds. So, it is a process of raising money. And so you do get a lens into how venture at least thinks, and how venture reacts to things like IRA. I want to use today specifically the penalty, the difference between the 13 years of when price control starts with biologics versus 9 years with small molecules. And I think this is a good example of a few things. Number one is it clearly shows negotiation is the wrong word. And, I'm not a policy person. I'm a drug developer. I've been doing this 25 years. Like the introduction said, I've been involved in 2 successful drugs, and I can't tell you how many that haven't worked. So I certainly would welcome, if the government is going to look at cost, that would be great. Let's also add the cost of the very small chance, even the first 1 out of 10 drugs that makes your first clinical trial, only one of those even gets approved, and that's before the hundreds probably don't even make it to the first in human trial. So cost would be great if you would account for how risky and the odds likelihood of what we do. And so my career is an example of that. In 25 years, I've been involved in 2 successful drugs, and then a whole ton that haven't. And frankly, a lot of my peers, 2 is probably a good place to hang up I'm mid-career, but 2 successful drugs is about a good average for a 40-year drug developer life, of contribution. I have a few slides. Let's see, and I don't know if I should advance these or do you want me to share my screen? I'll just share.
How about that? You want me to put
perfect.
it?
Yes. Yeah, you got it. Okay, great. And then shall I just ask you to advance? That's good. But let's hold it right here. So the last summer I was out fundraising, and I've been involved in small molecules. I've been involved in some very complex biologics. I fundraised for non-colitic virus, which is about as complex as you can get. But I was fundraising last summer, really a few months after the act passed. And I kind of noticed sort of anecdotally frankly, less interest in small molecules. I had some anecdotal conversations with some, very top venture funds. They said, Steve, is there any way to look at this problem with a biologic? Can you do an injection versus a pill? And I just was thinking, are you kidding me? Like from a patient standpoint, like does anybody on this call, ever want to take an injectable versus a pill? I mean, it's so backwards from how what we think is the best approach just for delivering medicine, and also, of course, it's the small molecules where you have the prices just drop once they come off patent, because there's very little it's very little barriers to making a competitive small drug than there is versus a biologic. So those were kind of comments, and they got me thinking. I was like, am I the only one seeing this impact already? I had a really honored to work with No Patients Left Behind, which is a really wonderful organization, a lot of volunteer work by a number of people in the venture community. And one of their big focuses has been on this 9 versus 13-year impact. And so I was encouraged to, think about maybe doing a survey and trying to get quantitative data on this. And if I use an analogy here, think of a typical cancer clinical trial. So, the first thing you work, for 5-6 years to actually get it first in human. And you then have really anecdotes. You get it in a couple patients, you see response, you're trying to dose escalation, but all you have is really a few, almost just case studies based on how the drug is doing. Then you start to do a phase 1, and you'll get dozens of patients, and you start to have a little bit of preliminary data. And then if that's successful, then you have a phase 2 and a phase 3 and ultimately approval. And it takes about a 4 to 6 year process from first in human to actual approval. 1 out of 10 of those actually work. So if I use that analogy on a negative way and say, okay, IRA Act came out in summer of 2022, how do we measure the impact over the next 4 to 6 years of this policy? And so what we're seeing, initially was some anecdotes. So you saw some large pharmas with press releases saying, we're getting out of that business because it just doesn't make sense to develop small molecules for the elderly when you're cutting off basically half of the opportunity to make, to have profits come back. You see anecdotes there. You saw my first anecdotes, on the other side of that, as a small biotech entrepreneur raising money. The next thing is really like, phase 1 data sets. So, were there any data sets we could create to kind of look at this and see, is there already being impact? And here are 2 that came out, mine and then another one that I'll show from BioCentury that came out around the same time. And so what I did is I surveyed 100 venture funds. I'm out there raising money anyway, so it was easy to do that. And I kept it very simple. I asked really two main questions. Are you experiencing changes in funding for small molecules versus biologics as a result of the IRA, as a direct result of the IRA? And the bottom line here is that I think it was 85%. So this is 1 out of 7, 6 out of 7 of venture funds are seeing significant decrease in interest in funding small molecules for large populations because of direct result of the IRA. So that was pretty astonishing. And go back and think about, when you're fundraising and you can expect, 50 to 100 no's for when you finally get your money together, to launch a new venture. And then think it's 6 out of 7 of those funders are saying, we're out of it. We're out of this space. I mean, that's pretty almost jaw-dropping. My second question was, okay, regardless of IRA, put that on the side for a minute. how do small molecules compare to antibodies in terms of development and approval risk? And this kind of goes back to, I did the same thing that Chuck did, trying to figure out where did 9 years versus 13 years come from? And it literally came from nowhere. I mean, it must have been invented in a backroom discussion, because I try to track it. There's absolutely nothing nothing logical that you can hang your hat on for any reason why there was a difference in treatment. But there was certainly a few people that said, oh, well, small molecules are easy, they're less risky, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those of us in development, do not think that way. And so I wanted to quantify that as well. And basically it's half and half. If you're a small molecule drug developer, you probably think the other, the grass is greener in biologics. And if you're a biologic drug developer, you probably think there's less risky in small molecules. But the point here is one is not easier than the other. They're both tools that we need, desperately need in areas like cancer and in neuroscience. You need both of these in your toolkit. So that was my survey. That came out in March, about 100 VCs, and clearly 6 out of 7 VCs are pulling out have already been impacted by this. Let's go to the next slide. So another one that was really nice that was run by BioCentury, and I really applaud them for being ahead of the curve here. They did kind of about a similar survey and ran this as well, asked different questions. And I'm going to use the next few slides just to sort of, I think, help frame the various ways that a legislative decision making impacts what is a very long planning session, for developing new drugs. So next slide. I'll just walk through a few of these because they did a nice job kind of pointing out some of the impacts. So, orphan drug designation, there's a number of small companies say, well, if we just get one orphan drug in the market, that's good enough. And then basically, we want to exit to large pharma anyway, so it's not going to immediately impact us. But you certainly see that you're going to get, instead of thinking orphan drug as a start, as you get one approval in a pyramid kind of a setting, and then work your way to broader populations with more orphan drug designations. You can see here the impact is like you may not want to go beyond one orphan drug because of IRA. Next slide. This is really a concern. The starting in small indications will fall out of favor. And, it's one thing to say, well, obviously, if you're going to only give me 9 years in which to recoup money, I'm going to have to go after the largest indication possible. That's fine to say that, but in cancer doesn't work that way. And neuroscience increasingly doesn't work that way. I mean, what you're seeing in neuroscience drug development is what you see we've been doing in cancer for the last 30 years, which is basically going after individual small populations and tumors, figuring out how the drug works, and then expanding from there. And we're seeing that same trend in Alzheimer's is a great example there. But you really can't do that. You're not incentivized to do that now. You basically have to somehow think about what's the biggest population I can use this new drug on and go there. And so you can see it's a huge disincentive to come up with a really new MOA and then also try to play a game of saying, I'm going to apply this to this massive, patient population. It's very unlikely to work. So while we are going to see these small indications fall out of favor, the reality is that it's incredibly difficult to try to forecast and plan for a novel mechanism in a large population in Alzheimer's or across many different kinds of tumors. Next slide. And I liked how BioCentury called out a few of these here, and we're certainly living this. The disincentive, for example, of encouraging trials for new indications late in the window before price setting. At the last slide I have is some resources, and I had a really nice interview with Dr. Rafael Fonseca, who has been a longtime leader in multiple myeloma, and he said, Steve, what we have done in myeloma is typically applied these drugs that get approved in other areas and we take them into myeloma. That's been a standard practice in small molecules. That's going to go out the window. And he said, I'm really worried about that, because why would somebody risk IRA, getting under IRA and applying this into it in a smaller area like a multiple myeloma? So that's another reality we're living. Next slide. So pipeline and a product. I mean, this is where, again, the whole approach, especially in oncology, but also in autoimmune, is you get approval in one small area and then you build from there, and you basically build a pipeline and a product. And this is how you get funding when you're in a venture stage and you say, look, I want to build a drug for this small niche population, the immediate next question in the boardroom, when you're raising money is, well, how are you going to expand this business? And if you say, well, or not, you can imagine what it's going to do to people actually funding this. So pipeline a product, 2/3 of the people on the respondents thought this is likely to become a thing of the past. Next slide. And then this, absolutely, we're living this. This isn't hard. This isn't hard math. You sit with an investor and you say, all right, the odds are low, but we've got a really good drug here. This is a really good idea. We've got great preclinical data. And by the way, I can get 13 years, which will allow me, barely to recoup my costs versus 9 years. And those last 4 years may not seem significant, but that's where all the money is made. Drug development takes a long time. In medicine, it takes people a long time to change. So no matter how good a drug is, the sales always ramp up late. And so those last 4 years, you're cutting off pretty much half of the profits just by going from 9 to 13. So of course, you're going to see a shift from small molecules to biologics. And those two surveys, what I'm saying is we're already seeing this shift. The damage has already happened, and it's just going to keep happening. Next slide. So this is interesting here too, because a number of my peers, I work in an area called targeted therapy. And so there's a lot of companies, these are, typically either public or private targeted therapy companies. And, they're going after a smaller indication. So they're saying, look, we don't see this direct impact, but what maybe it's more a problem of larger pharma. So this is certainly a trend I see here. And, I may be a bit of a canary in the coal mine here, but I think you're going to see more and more of this impact as the larger pharmas start in dialoguing with the smaller biotechs, small as they are, say, look, this is impacting the price we'll pay for you, for the work you've done to date, for this drug in M&A. Next slide. So I put a few resources here, and this has, again, been sort of my journey and my lens of trying to, in the last year, put some data around what the impact has been. And so this is, again, like a cancer trial. Some of this was anecdotal. I had a few articles that I wrote, and really mostly for the lay person to get them interested in what was going on, to understand drug development, to understand why it's risky, to understand that if you're going to cost out drug development, you better cost out how challenging it is to actually do this and all the failures that go along with the occasional win. So there's some anecdotes in there. I have my survey and also BioCentury's survey. And there's two really good interviews that I thought were very revealing. One was with Dr. Fonseca, and the other was Dr. McAmeny, one in Arizona and one in New Mexico. A lot of this also has come out with some from my view, with some really good interaction with, my two state senators and their staffs who have actually been very open to discussion, but the message has been, Steve, can you get data? And so I think, if I just zoom out a little bit, if you think about the medical device tax and, how finally that was able to be defeated, it was with data, to be able to really say, no, this has hugely hit medical device innovation. And I think I just challenge all of us to think about not just anecdotes from either large pharma, from venture, not just these two surveys, which are sort of phase 1 data sets, but how do we really think about measuring the impact? And the challenge here is that what ultimately we're talking about is a whole number of small molecule drugs across neurosciences, Alzheimer's, across a number of cancer areas, across other areas, are basically just not going to get developed. So how do you measure drugs that are not going to get developed over the next 6 to 10 years because of this IRA, unless it gets changed, particularly small molecule penalty? And how do we approach measuring that so we can have data and take that data and say, look, it is already happening and it's going to continue to happen. So that's kind of where my mind is next, is how do we build kind of the phase 2, phase 3 data set equivalents, to show what the impact really is. So thank you. Again, I'm not a policy person. I would be happy just to continue to develop drugs and leave this whole issue on the side. But the reality is it's affecting fundraising. I'm one example. And but hopefully I'm a pretty clear example of what happens when investors are trying to look out 10 to 15 years and make economic predictions. when you have a governmental change that frankly is not a negotiation, they weren't included in the discussion, and then you have to adjust to that. And so you see some very adverse effects.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Potts. That was very informative.